Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start with the U.S. press. We're going to take two from the U.S., we'll take two from international, and then we'll go from there depending on the secretary. So let us start with...
Now, hold on, John.
Sir.
I'm going to talk first.
Roger that.
It is great to be here at NATO with 31 allies, also with my wife, Jenny, who's been meeting with families of U.S. troops, both here in Germany, and we're heading to Poland right after this as well. That's what this is all about for me, for President Trump, and the Defense Department. I also want to express a special thanks to the Secretary General Ruta, for your boldness, for your friendship, for your leadership, and most especially for your urgency of the matter at hand, which is great to see from the leader of NATO. Look forward to working very closely with him and his team. And before we're talking about what we've done at the Ministerial, I want to reaffirm a few things from this podium. First, as we see it, NATO's strategic objectives are to prevent great power conflict in Europe, deter nuclear and non-nuclear aggression, and defeat threats to treaty allies should deterrence fail. Second, the U.S. is committed to building a stronger, more lethal NATO. However, we must ensure that European and Canadian commitment to Article 3 of this treaty is just as strong. Article 3 says that allies, and I quote, by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. Leaders of our European allies should take primary responsibility for defense of the continent, which means security ownership by all allies, guided by a clear understanding of strategic realities, and it's an imperative given the strategic realities that we face. And that begins with increasing defense spending. 2% is a start, as President Trump has said, but it's not enough. Nor is 3%, nor is 4%, more like 5%. Real investment, real urgency. We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags, and you can't shoot strong speeches. There is no replacement for hard power. As much as we may not want to like the world we live in some cases, there's nothing like hard power. It should be obvious that increasing allied European defense spending is critical, as the President of the United States has said. Also critical is expanding our defense industrial base capacity on both sides of the Atlantic. Our dollars, our euros, our pounds must become real capabilities. The U.S. is fully committed under President Trump's leadership to pursue these objectives in the face of today's threats. Yesterday, I had a chance to attend the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Today, participated in both the NATO Ministerial and the Ukraine Council. In both, we discussed Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I had the chance to brief allies on President Trump's top priority, a diplomatic, peaceful end to this war, as quickly as possible, in a manner that creates enduring and durable peace. The American Defense Department fully supports the efforts of the Trump administration. And we look to allies to support this important work with leading on Ukraine security assistance now through increased contributions and greater ownership of future security assistance to Ukraine. To that end, I want to thank my UK counterpart, Defense Secretary John Healey, for hosting this Ukraine Defense Contact Group and for his leadership on support of Ukraine. President Trump gave me a clear mission: achieve peace through strength, as well as put America first, our people, our taxpayers, our borders, and our security. We are doing this by reviving the warrior ethos, rebuilding our military, and reestablishing deterrence. NATO should pursue these goals as well. NATO is a great alliance, the most successful defense alliance in history. But to endure for the future, our partners must do far more for Europe's defense. We must make NATO great again. It begins with defense spending, but must also include reviving the transatlantic defense industrial base, rapidly fielding emerging technologies, prioritizing readiness and lethality, and establishing real deterrence. Finally, I want to close with this. After World War II, first General and then President Eisenhower was one of NATO's strongest supporters. He believed in a strong relationship with Europe. However, by the end of Eisenhower's presidency, even he was concerned that Europe was not shouldering enough of its own defense, nearly making, in Eisenhower's words, quote, a sucker out of Uncle Sam. Well, like President Eisenhower, this administration believes in alliances, deeply believes in alliances. But make no mistake, President Trump will not allow anyone to turn Uncle Sam into Uncle Sucker. Thank you, and we're glad to take some questions.
Thanks very much. Let's start with the U.S. traveling TV pool with Liz Ferdinand.
And air patrols on the
Thank you, Secretary Hegseth. You have focused on what Ukraine is giving up. What concessions will Putin be asked to make?
As part of a coordination with how we're executing these ongoing negotiations, which are led by President Trump. All of that said, these negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump. So I'm not going to stand at this podium and declare what President Trump will do or won't do, what will be in or what will be out. what concessions will be made or what concessions are not made. I can look, as our team has, of what's realistic, likely on an outcome. I think realism is an important part of the conversation that hasn't existed enough inside conversations amongst friends. But simply pointing out realism, like the borders won't be rolled back to what everybody would like them to be in 2014, is not a concession to Vladimir Putin. It's a recognition of hard power realities on the ground after a lot of investment and sacrifice, first by the Ukrainians and then by allies, and then a realization that a negotiated peace is going to be some sort of demarcation that neither side wants. But it's not my job as the Secretary of Defense to define the parameters of the President of the United States as he leads some of the most complex and consequential negotiations in the world.
Sticking with the U.S. press, let us go with Axios' Zach Basu, right in the far right.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Given the position you've now staked out, what leverage exactly is Ukraine being left with, especially if the U.S. also plans to wind down its military aid? And then quickly, if a NATO ally is attacked by Russia or any country, will the U.S. unequivocally uphold its obligations under Article 5, regardless of that country's...
Well, we've said we're committed to the alliance, and that's part of the alliance, right? You point out Article 5, you point out Article 3. It's just a cheap...
Highly placed and trusted from their,
to say, oh, we've left all the negotiating cards. Just a cheap political point to say, oh, we've left all the negotiating cards off the table by recognizing some realities that exist on the ground. President Zelensky understands the realities on the ground, President Putin understands the realities on the ground, and President Trump, as a deal maker, as a negotiator, understands those dynamics as well. By no means is anything that I state here, even though we lead the most powerful military in the world, hemming in the commander-in-chief in his negotiations to ultimately decide where it goes or does not go. Well, he's got all the cards he would like. And the interesting part is, oftentimes, while the conventional status quo mindset or the legacy media wants to play checkers, the same checkers game we've been playing for decades, President Trump, time and time again, finds a way to play chess. As a deal maker, as a businessman who understands how to create realities and opportunities where they otherwise may not exist. Take, for example, the conversations that our Treasury Secretary had in Kiev recently with President Zelensky, which will continue in Munich with our Vice President and Secretary of State, around investments and resources inside Ukraine. I don't want to get ahead of any decision or announcement that could be made there. It could be any number of parameters. But President Trump, as a deal maker and a businessman, recognizes that an investment relationship with Ukraine, ultimately in the long term for the United States, ultimately in the long term for the United States, promises or is a lot more tangible than any have, even though we have them. There is something to relationships and deals in real ways, whether militarily or economically or diplomatically, that he sees that are possibilities that could forge together a lot of opportunities to show that solidarity that Vladimir Putin will clearly recognize. That's one of any number of other opportunities that this president will leverage in these high-stakes negotiations. So I just reject on its face the premise that somehow President Trump isn't dealing with a full set of cards when he's the one that can determine ultimately what cards he holds.
Great. Now shifting to the international press, we'll take the French wire service Agence France Presse with Max Delaney.
Status quo mindset.
Thank you very much. Secretary of Defense, you've spoken about trying to force both Putin and Zelensky to the table. Can you give a guarantee that no deal will be forced on Ukraine that they do not want to accept, and also that you will include Europe in the negotiations about an issue that concerns European security? And can you tell us whether the U.S. will continue to supply arms to Ukraine during any negotiations?
Well, to the first part of your question, that's not ultimately my decision. The President will lead these negotiations alongside our Secretary of State, our National Security Advisor,
negotiations.
And numerous other officials that will be involved. And ultimately, we've played our role in talking to our NATO allies about what that would look like. President Trump, I want to point out, I've got the truths right here that he posted called both, in case we missed it, Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky. As we see
Called
it,
them both.
NATO's
Any
strategic
negotiation that's
objectives
had will be
are
had
to
with
prevent great power conflict in
I also am
Europe,
very encouraged by what the
deter
Secretary General has
nuclear
said.
and non-nuclear aggression,
Clearly attune
and defeat
to the realities of the moment,
to treaty allies
the need for peace,
should deterrence
and that the NATO alliance and European members will
Second,
play a
the
role
U.S. is
in
committed
that.
to building a stronger,
Ultimately,
more lethal
President
NATO.
Trump speaking to those two countries.
However,
is
we
central
must
to the
ensure that
European aid, but it
European
affects
and
a lot of
Canadian
people.
commitment to Article
Of course,
3
I'm not going to
of
get
this
involved in
treaty
those
is just as strong.
intimate diplomatic
Article
negotiations.
3
That's for the
says
pros
that
the Trump
allies, and I
administration who
quote,
do diplomacy and
by
negotiations.
means of continuous
Ultimately,
and
as
effective
security
self-help
assistance,
and mutual
we
aid,
have
will
continued
maintain
to
and
provide
develop
what
their
has been
individual
allocated.
and collective capacity
I think it would be fair to say
to
that
resist
things like
armed
future funding,
attack.
either less or more,
Leaders of our European
could be on the
allies
table
should take
in
primary
negotiations as well.
responsibility.
Whatever the president
Defense
determines is the most robust,
Which means security
carrot or
ownership
stick
by
on
all
either side
allies,
to induce
guided by a clear
durable,
understanding of
peace.
strategic realities,
Understanding,
and it's an
obviously,
imperative given the
motivations that Vladimir
strategic
Putin has
realities
had.
that
Less or more,
leaders of our European allies.
Thank you.
And
We'll have a
that
second
begins with
international press
increasing
outlet. We'll go with
defense
the German
spending.
paper, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung,
2%
with
is a
Dr.
start,
Thomas
as
Kutscher.
President Trump has said, but it's not enough. Nor is 3%, nor is 4%, more like 5%.
Mr. Secretary,
Real investment, real
first one
urgency.
regarding the new defense investment pledge. When you and President Trump speak about raising it to 5%, do you mean European allies only, or do you mean the US as well, which is currently at 3.4% according to NATO statistics? And if the latter is true, when do you think the US could possibly reach the goal of spending 5% on defense? That's number one. Number two, you've said yesterday that Europeans need to take ownership of their own conventional security. So should Europeans expect that ultimately the US would withdraw the bulk of their forces from Europe and just leave in place what is necessary for nuclear deterrence? I know there's a revision going on. I don't expect you to name any numbers, but maybe give
When
us an outline of
HDMI-1
what we
didn't
should
show
expect.
up, and
Thank you.
I'm messing around.
Should contest the extent of America's willingness to invest in national security. We have a budget of $850 billion spent on defense. I'm in the business of ensuring that every dollar of that is used wisely, which is why we're pushing a Pentagon audit and making sure that we're cutting fat so that we've got more at the tip of the spear. 3.4% is a very robust investment, larger than most of our allies within NATO. Any defense minister or secretary of defense that tells you they wouldn't want more would be lying to you. I understand that. Ultimately, we have our own budgetary considerations to be had, but I don't think an unwillingness of NATO allies to invest in their own defense spending can be dismissed away by trying to point at the $900 billion that America has invested around the globe to include the NATO alliance and saying that's not enough. So ultimately, we are very much committed to the NATO alliance and to our allies, but without burden sharing, without creating the right set of incentives for European countries to invest,